A mother and daughter move in next door, and everything seems to be going well until they paint their fence in the colors of the rainbow. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angles brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, men in a little neighborhood called Penns Hill in Pennsylvania, a couple of women who are lesbians moved into this neighborhood and apparently heard one of their neighbors make a disparaging remark about homosexuals and decided that they would paint their fence as a kind of act of rebellion, retribution, rebuke, however you want to look at that. And they painted the so-called rainbow flag of the LGBTQ movement on their fence. At which point, apparently, they felt that they had been subjected by their neighbor to homophobic slurs, as they're called. And at that point, they decided they'd paint part of their house in the colors of the rainbow flag. And then it became kind of a community issue. A lot of people rallied in support around the female couple. And eventually, the neighbor who had been bigoted had decided he would kind of lay low and leave things alone. And the women decided that they would probably go ahead and paint the whole house in the colors of the rainbow flag. And I thought that this raised a couple of interesting questions because on the one hand, as a libertarian-minded kind of person, as a classical liberal, I agree with what the women were literally quoted as saying, which is, we don't want to be friends, we just want to be left alone. Like they don't care. They don't care about their neighbor being friends with them. They just say we want to be left alone. So I'm with that. On the other hand, when somebody so radically changes the appearance of the outside of their house, that can have an effect on property values. And so I think it raises some interesting questions for classical liberals and for people who like a small footprint of government and for people who like freedom of speech and for people who like their property values. Stephen Green. I lived up until last year in a neighborhood that had a homeowners association, an HOA, as we call them around here in the north of the Dallas area. And there were all kinds of restrictions. They'd send you a note if you did not trim your hedges when you were supposed to, and you weren't allowed to change oil in your driveway or do any repairs on your car. Do we really own our homes, Stephen Green? Or why can't I do as I please on my own property?
Oh, that's always the trick, isn't it? As Bill has mentioned on other segments, as long as you're paying a property tax, it doesn't matter if your mortgage is zero and you own your house. You're really just renting it from the government. And, if you make any improvements, guess what? Your taxes go up. So what I want to know is everybody in this little neighborhood going to get their property taxes cut because of a kind of crazy paint job? Boy, I kind of feel for everybody on this one, as you indicated in your intro there, Scott. When I was living in San Francisco in this little apartment building on the 900 block of Geary, I'm pretty sure that some of my neighbors in the building were actually straight, and I'm not just talking about my girlfriend and I at the time. So I obviously have no issue with any of my neighbors doing whatever it is they do. That's their business. It does sort of become my business when they start to paint their house in the rainbow flag, not because it's the rainbow flag and represents anything in particular, but because it might be seen as garish if I'm ever trying to sell my house. On the flip side, I think it's Coral Gables, Florida, has the most restrictive HOA in the entire nation, where they actually have neighborhood Budinskis, for lack of a better word, who are allowed to critique and bring the HOA down on you for the painting on the interior of your house. If they don't like the color of your living room and they can see it from your window, and by the way, there are even regulations, I believe, that these are still in effect, that your curtains have to be open during daylight hours. I mean, stuff like this. This HOA is just brutal. But it really has almost nothing on what happened here in Colorado. This has got to be 15, 20 years ago now. I believe it was in Aspen. Again, you get to Aspen and they're huge, huge homes, multi-million-dollar mansions owned by the likes of Jack Nicholson and whatnot. We actually had somebody commit suicide, a very wealthy man commit suicide over a years-long battle with the Aspen HOA that was literally costing him millions of dollars. And he finally ended up, I don't know if he was actually broke or not, but just in despair over this, and maybe this works into Bill's topic this week, actually killed himself. So I think somewhere between neighbors sort of one-upping each other and getting a little snippy and driving people to suicide, maybe we can find some sort of balance. I don't want to take it any further than that because I've been working with you for a long time, and I think I might know where you want to go with this segment. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now.
As if I ever know where I want to go with the segment. I just want to go to where you are, my friend. We have our dreams. Bill Whittle, this poses a fascinating dilemma. You know, the old line about my liberty to swing my fist extends as far as the end of your nose. You would like to think that you could do whatever you wanted to your own home if you actually own the thing. And yet, I could see that there are not only this issue of the painting of a house, but there are other issues that could overlap. As in our pre-production meeting show, which is available to members only at BillWhittle.com, we talked about the idea of blasting your music, for example. I've gone to, although this isn't directly related to homes, like we go to a public beach and there are people at public beaches who feel that they have the best music and everybody ought to share it. And so they actually affect the experience of being at that public beach. And you could do the same thing in a neighborhood where you're saying, hey, you know, I didn't move here for this. I moved to this nice little neighborhood where everybody's houses look the same. And now we have this freakish trailer trash thing showing up in the middle of it. Where do you come down on this, Bill? This is a tough nut to crack from a liberty standpoint, isn't it?
Well, it is. And first of all, let me just say that I went to Coral Gables High School, and if there's another American Revolution, the First Amendment will be to protect us from homeowners associations,
That would be awesome.
rather than foreign troops. It is interesting how something as small and as unofficial, when I say unofficial, I mean not backed by force of law or legislation, that actually has the most power over our lives, because these homeowner associations really do have the power to tell you, paint your house this color, and I just find that repugnant. So look, I'm with the lesbians on this one. If you can't paint your house your own color, if you can't do with your own house what you want to do, then it's not your house. Put aside, as Steve mentioned, that if you have to pay property taxes, you're simply renting your house from the government. If you don't pay the rent, they'll come and take your house. But put that aside for a minute. Sometimes, we have a. This is where the gray areas of life sometimes have to be a little resolved. And I have a couple of different guiding principles, and sometimes I just have to put them in the balance, and that's why I thought this was a great topic, so we could get to that. It is not just a slogan, it's a philosophy. This is what I live by. I believe I have the right to do anything I want to. I can swing my fist until it contacts somebody else's nose. So the question becomes, is a house that's painted strangely harming the people next to them? You could say, well, yes, it's suppressing property values. You could say that, I suppose. But that's not really direct harm. I mean, they're not going over the fence and pouring mercury into your yard. They're doing what they want with their own property, and just because you happen to be in proximity to them doesn't mean they don't have the right to do what they want with their own property. And the way I usually try to think of things like this is I try to find an example of something that I would feel pretty strongly about. If I decided to paint my house like an American flag, and somebody told me that I couldn't do it because it was hurting the values of other people's homes, I'd tell them to go pound sand. I'm going to paint my house any damn color I want to. And I think most conservatives would probably back that guy. There are homeowners associations and things of this nature that say you can't have an American flagpole in your yard.
Yeah.
You can't have a flag of a certain size. My feeling is I paid for this ground. If I want to have the entire thing be with a flag the size of the biggest car dealership in the world, that is essentially my business and not yours.
But Bill, didn't you submit yourself to the governance of that homeowners association by buying a property in that neighborhood?
Look, if I've never had to deal with the homeowners association. If I signed on a dotted line, then I've accepted a private contract that supersedes my constitutional rights because I signed them away.
Okay, and let me follow up with one question, because I think that's fair, and we don't know that this neighborhood in Penn Hills is an HOA. I doubt it is. Pennsylvania doesn't have as many of those as Texas does, because most of their neighborhoods are much older. But the idea that this isn't just these ladies thought it would be nice to paint their house. They're actually making a statement. This is an act of speech, so to speak, done visually. Should they be protected by the First Amendment in that freedom of speech? Or does the guy whose property value may decline also have a word to say here?
Look, first of all, they are. I think they're categorically protected by the First Amendment guarantee of free speech, but they're protected by something that even precedes the First Amendment, and that is the right of private property. This is their property; they own it. They can do what they want with it. I have to be consistent in my views. If they should not have to force a guy to bake a cake he doesn't want to bake. That's not their business. If these two lesbians want to open up a cafe that says that conservative white males not allowed, that's their business. It's their business. That's their cafe. That's the way I look at it. It's just the way it is. I'll go someplace else. And you don't have a right to not be offended. You don't have a right to not be influenced by what your neighbors do. I think the strongest case you could make for actual harm would be something like loud music. To the degree that it prevented you from sleeping and doing your job, you have now actually physically impacted that person's life. But Scotty, look, if you're on the side of the neighbor on this one, then you're basically saying that he also has the right to say, I don't think you should paint your house pink, because I think a pink house would be bad for the neighborhood. Or I think a brighter green than is normal would be bad for the neighborhood. And you're giving essentially your private property privileges to people who live around you. And I'm just dead set against this on principle.
Hey, Billy. I'm sorry.
So one principle outweighs another. It's true that it may affect my property values. That's just unfortunate for me. But that's the way it goes.
Bill, let me throw something in here that you just made me think of. If I buy shares in a company, that's my property that I own. It's not real property, but it's property I own in another company. That doesn't give me a right to shut out competitors that might adversely affect the value of my shares, the value of my property.
Correct. If you buy a few shares in Apple, you own Apple, but you own a rather small percentage of Apple. So let's just take a company that you own completely. It's your company. Yes, you do not have the right to violate the law in terms of your property. But what law are we talking about here? If there was a homeowners association and they had voluntarily signed a private contract with the individuals in that homeowners association, they'd be bound by the terms of that contract because they're adult people who voluntarily made a contract agreement,
yes.
And that's law, and that's the way it goes. But if they didn't do that, then they can do whatever they want to.
Bingo.
And I think it's pretty simple, really.
Probably the most comical examples of this that I have seen have been in cities, and actually back when I lived in Pennsylvania, where there would be houses that were duplexes, and one side of the house would be painted in this just really bizarre fashion, and then the other house was just kind of a normal house in muted colors with appropriate trim and all that kind of stuff. But you buy the half of the house. You can actually purchase half of this house, and the guy on the other side is doing whatever he pleases. Or in some cases, one half of the house would be well maintained, the other half has the gutters falling off and the shutters falling off, and broken windows and stuff like that. It is a challenge to live with one another, is it not? And I think when we look at this particular situation, if you track it back to its source, it may be that a neighbor deciding to mouth off about somebody else's choices triggered the kind of over-the-fence spat that has been the fodder for comedy for years. And it may have the better part of valor for that neighbor when he saw the lesbians moving in next door may have been to mind his own business. And unless they were interfering in some way with his life, leave them alone. It's not illegal for two women to live together, and frankly, it's not his business. Now, does that mean that you're saying, well, I think lesbianism is okay and I'm all for homosexuality? No, it doesn't mean that. You can still oppose something or see something as sin or think that it should be illegal or whatever, as long as you're not interfering in the lives of other people. And these women clearly struck back and basically said, we're not going to take it. No, we ain't going to take it anymore by painting their fence and then saying, hey, say another word and I'll paint the entire house. That was kind of the attitude.
You're worthless and weak.
We're going to dye the grass next. So, I think if we're going to learn to live together in this country with people who see things differently, who behave differently, who act differently, it would behoove us to assume a winsomeness of approach to others that is designed not to alienate, but to win them over as friends. What a different thing it would have been if you had brought a cake over to welcome your new neighbors.
Especially if you force somebody to bake it.
Bake it.
That's right. It says if you could
Beat me
compel
to it,
someone
Bill.
to make a cake. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I think most of the people watching this show probably would have seen things that way and said, whether I agree with their lifestyle or not, it's not my business to hurl insults at them, and life will go smoother if you have good relationships with your neighbors. And that's how we conduct ourselves as conservatives and as classical liberals and as libertarians. And I think that's what would make this country a much better place. And there, frankly, would be a lot less protest on the left if people on the other side were a little less offensive. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.